Okay, hopefully folks can now see the PowerPoint as well as hear us. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. Welcome again to Auckland for those of us here in Tamaki Makaurau, and welcome to the folks online. My name is John Egan, and I am going to talk briefly about the peer review of digital teaching in the post-pandemic world. It's a very grandiose title, but please lower your expectations accordingly. This is very much a work in progress. Before I go into the paper itself, kind of the impetus behind this is a big part of my role is teaching quality. And there's two aspects of teaching quality that's involved in. One of them is about ensuring that we have appropriate levels of professional development and academic development support in this actual faculty, the Faculty of Medical Health Sciences. And there are particular instances and challenges about doing that, for example, around clinical teaching, where if 60% of your program is actually taught in hospitals or in offsite clinics, how do you review that teaching for teaching quality? The other side is as in my leadership role, sometimes I get lists of what I call the naughty chair from the university, people whose teaching evaluations are not considered to the appropriate level or standard for the university. And every institution has its metrics on these. Ours is, we have a capstone question on whether the students are satisfied with the course, which I think is a terrible question because I don't really care if they're satisfied. I want to know if they learned. But we have to, the goal is 80% satisfaction and the floor is 70% satisfaction, but that's with an appropriate response rate in our student evaluations. We have a problem with evaluation response rates in our university that makes these data very difficult to meaningfully use anyway. But there are all sorts of issues with student evaluation of teaching data that could lend itself to the being data that actually not have very little to do with actually the quality of teaching, or even more specifically, the quality of learning. And so one way to kind of triangulate against that single data point being somewhat or entirely hegemonic, which it often is in this university, we looked for other mechanisms for teaching quality. The most obvious one is student performance data, is what are the pass rates, what are the distributions, our grades, are we getting the sort of quality of work from students that we would anticipate that would indicate, good quality teaching. But the third is the peer review of teaching, which is a particular passion of mine, and it has been for, well, I didn't have hair when I was interested in this, but I had maybe less gray in my mustache back then. And an equal passion for me is flexible learning, specifically online learning, because I have taught almost exclusively online in terms of my university teaching for about a decade. And I really like it. And I think it's awesome when it's done well. So, COVID-19. Anyone experienced COVID-19? No? Still all blacked it out, right? Yeah. So, there were massive disruptions to business as usual teaching practices, and there was the rapid pivot to remote learning. I know a lot of folks in academic development that refused to use the word pivot ever again, because they felt like it wasn't a pivot, it was like being on a spinning top. And someone kept pulling the string again and again and again and making it go faster and faster. And with this rapid pivot to remote learning, there was very limited staff support for the actual pivot. And at this university, we had the misfortune of the 6 months or a year before the pivot of disestablishing our educational services unit at the university level. So my little team of 3 people were the only staff who were really explicitly identified with providing this sort of support. So we did something very local. But what happened, regardless of the level of support you did, is people did a massive lift and shift of what they were going to do in their classes when they were teaching them face-to-face, as much and as close as proximate as possible, doing it remotely, using the internet. I am not using the O word for a reason. So why am I interested in peer review of teaching? Well, I think Van Note Chisholm's definition is a really good one, which it provides informed colleague judgment about faculty teaching for either fostering improvement or making personnel decisions. And that collegial judgment is super important. And that collegial judgment, and using the same language as we use in the research enterprise, peer review in terms of development, applying for grants, and for teaching quality in terms of publications, right? So if we all agree that peer review in the research and science part can be extremely problematic and terribly unpleasant, and if you haven't yet, go on to Twitter and do a search for reviewer 2, and all the memes that people have written about reviewer two. You know, the first person says it's an interesting paper and I like this about it, and then I could do a revision. Reviewer two says, you're an idiot, you're a moron, I can't believe you sent this in, and you should just go under a rock and die. Thank you for submitting your work. Putting that aside for peer judgment, what peer judgment allows us to do in teaching is it allows us to take a more longitudinal view of what a person's teaching practice is. And it specifically allows us to look at, for example, if someone's hired in their early career academic role and they're provided with some mentorship around teaching, it starts with an initial peer review and then develops a plan on how people can develop their competencies and skills and confidence, which a lot of about teaching success is confidence. You now have a process by which we can both develop people formatively, but also at a very reasonably confident level saying, in terms of what I would expect my colleagues to be able to do at this level of the career, this is good teaching, or this is great teaching, or this is teaching that is much better than it was. And it's clear, and we will get it to where it will be good by doing A, B, C, and Z. And some people do need to go to Z, unfortunately, right? So this formative process on development is very well supported in the literature. The summative use of peer review, actually using it as a mechanism explicitly for appraising teaching quality, teaching performance, is less supported in literature. And I actually think that's a massive mistake because we're just ceding the quality discussion to students if we don't do this. I am not a perfect teacher. I'm a pretty good teacher. And the way I got from being a good teacher to a pretty good teacher was through peer support, mentorship, and also peers saying, you really need to stop telling those jokes that start with the letter F. You think you're really cool for the kids, but actually you're just making yourself look unprofessional. Very hard to let go of those F-bombs, but I've done it. So, oh, that's the same slide twice, right? But I also want to reiterate that the focus on this paper is remote teaching was not online learning. How many people here have taught online prior to COVID? How many of you think that remote learning was exactly the same as online learning? Oh, thank God. Yeah. Let the people online know that everybody's very quiet. No one wants to be rude except for me. It's not, because it wasn't designed to be. People were not given the opportunity to look at what the learning activities could be to achieve what they wanted to, that they were planning to do face-to-face. They simply said, here, move it onto the internet. Good luck and Godspeed, right? So we migrated activities. We didn't redesign things. And assessment was, a focus and a challenge. And there was an immediate over-reliance on transmissive pedagogies. And actually, that's a mistake that people often make the first time they teach online when things are purposefully designed online, because that lack of contact time that we're all socialized to, like, from being really successful learners ourselves, the idea that you don't have a timetable X number of hours every week, people panic and they think, well, I don't want to disadvantage my students, so I'm going to give them even more to read, because that will make it easier for them to learn because I'm giving them more, right? And actually the experience is usually cognitive overload. For COVID-19, the version of that was particularly pernicious was, I will just record my lecture. That will be great. We had students in this faculty, because of their timetabling, who had 6 hours of recorded lectures on some days. I would lose the will to live if I had to listen to people like me for 6 hours a day on a little screen, while I'm also worried about everything else that we were all worried about, particularly in 2020 and this new pandemic, right? So there was no reliance on transmissive pedagogies. There were very few things that were designed for eidolon affordances. I wasn't teaching in semester one, but if I had been teaching, I could have had the knowledge to redesign my course, but I wouldn't have had the time. Turnarounds were just too high. And so what happened is there were lots of poor practices that were brought forward after return to campus. People thought, oh, this worked pretty good, so I'm going to do this too. And so one of the things we did in our faculty is we did a kind of an unlearning process where we actually started doing workshops on actually what does good online learning pedagogy look like? How do you manage the asynchronous synchronous divide? When is it, how do you do differentiated instruction when you have 200 students in an online course who are all over the country and maybe a few of them offshore? So we've done a lot of that work in the faculty, which has been great. But what we found is that very few people wanted to reflect on what they did in 2020 and 2021. And those who did really wanted to make it clear, first and foremost, this was not their best practice at anything that they were doing. We were all flying by the seats of our pants. So there are lots of protocols for doing peer review of teaching. And the short version is you meet with the person before you do any observations. You talk about what they want to get out of the process. You negotiate the number of observations you're going to do. You observe their teaching. You provide some iterative feedback, including if you're going to do multiple observations, possibly some things they could try to work on for the next session. And then at the end, you produce some sort of documentation. Now, aside from being an academic developer, I'm an intensely political person and a trade unionist. And in institutions like universities, paper have power. So I'm really, really keen to make sure that if I'm going to produce a report on someone's teaching, that's in a report format. But if I'm going to give much more granular details and feedback for them for the formative development, that goes in a very unformatted thing, because I do not want people to include that in their portfolio, because those often things have little pieces of invisible barbed wire in it that promotion committees and continuation committees look at and say, oh, this person did this, and I don't know if that's a good idea. So from a political standpoint, I think it's super important for me to always provide two versions, a report and some feedback. And then it's up to the person if it's a formative review, if they want to use that in a portfolio or not. I try to write those things in a way that they are usable in a portfolio. I also don't say everybody's a brilliant teacher. If someone's a really bad teacher, I will say, I'd like to hold off on writing a report and let's talk about how we can make you a more confident teacher, because no one wants to be told that they're not a good teacher. But in most cases, it's a question, are they good, very good, excellent, outstanding, or are they Rhys Jones? So we don't all have to be Rhys Jones. That's not the standard that we need to aspire to. It would be great if we had that, but it's not necessary. So taking the principle of this and then integrating into what a review would be of online peer review of teaching, I always like, an additional step I always do is I always have students, people who are being reviewed, complete the teaching perspectives inventory, which is an inventory by Dan Pratt from UBC that allows people to reflect on their teaching and looks at what their beliefs, actions, and intentions are. I find it's a really good way to kind of get the person pre-involved with what we're going to be doing in this process and why teaching matters. And if I encounter some challenges in my teaching, what might be the possible explanations for that? And often it is my beliefs and values are certain things, but the institutional context I'm in means I can't actually have my actions align with my beliefs. And that frustrates me and it makes me feel unnatural as a teacher. So it's a really good chance to do that. Have a formal pre-observation meeting. And part of that, there is a discussion about the role of synchronous and asynchronous learning activities and how those have been balanced and why they've been balanced in the course. Because sometimes those are operational requirements, sometimes they're accreditation requirements, sometimes they're just personal preferences. Unpack that so you understand the why behind what you're about to see. And then an articulation of the interactivity strategy in the course design, because interactivity is the answer to most good teaching, but particularly online. I'm specifically speaking to the work of Anderson and his theory of online learning. And for number 5, this is a possible one. I know a surprising number of teachers who teach online who a lot of their teaching is actually done through email, because they really manage the pedagogical relationships with the students through it. I'm the opposite. All of my online teaching happens in my LMS, including using the message service in the LMS. I do not accept emails from my students. My co-teacher is smiling. And the reason I do that is I need to be able to focus on other parts of my job at some times. And if my inbox the day before an assessment is full of student queries, I feel obligated to prioritize that. Whereas I can timetable when I go onto the LMS and manage my comms with my students. So for me, it wouldn't be worth looking at my emails. Other people would say, yeah, I use it for my teaching, but I don't want that reviewed. That's fine too. So, and then finally, reviewing in advance, of course, any of the available course materials, negotiating the number and timing of observations, and then reaching understanding about the reporting the outcomes of the review. And that was the part I just spoke about a few minutes ago. Because sometimes people come with, I would say, unformed, some would say naive ideas about peer review teaching. But as someone who sits on our faculty staffing committee in this faculty, I can tell you the number of times where people have naively included too much data on their teaching rather than summarizing the student evaluation data, or they've included these really rambling, detailed notes or observations on their teaching, and people just hone in on those. And in particular, in our faculty, we're terrible at doing that if people are hired in teaching only roles, what we call professional teaching fellows. For some reason, I think people think that it's a reasonable thing that we should hold teaching fellows to a higher standard than lecturers. Actually, no. The standard is the standard. Your job title is a separate question. But they're kind of, well, if we're only paying them for teachers, shouldn't they be really, really good and amazing? Actually, we're paying everybody for teaching, and everyone should be equally of a good standard. or higher. So it's a bias. So that's the protocol. And so just kind of to wrap things up a little bit. So whether you're endeavoring to improve practice or to ascertain teacher quality, peer review teaching, it offers a different perspective than student voice mechanisms such as student evaluations. But with online learning, a relatively recent development in university teaching in particular, normative practices of peer review must be scrutinized and recalibrated when seeking to review a colleague's online teaching practice. And for those of us whom online delivery is routine, reflecting on the divergent ways teaching and assessing in online courses helps to refine the process. In other words, if you teach online, you should really get involved in peer review of teaching as a reviewer yourself, because that's how we will inform the practice most richly. And this also affords us opportunities to reflect on our own practices ourselves. How many people here have ever done a peer review of someone else's teaching? How many of you learned from that process while you're reviewing someone else's teaching, right? You know, and as my mother used to say in her wonderful New York accent when I was younger, there are two types of examples. I wish I was like you, and thank God I'm not you. And they both happen when you do peer review of teaching. I really want to do what you do. That's great. I'm going to give that a go. And that didn't go well. Not interested in that myself. And I think that is my last slide. Interrogate me, humiliate me, debase me. Yep. So the teaching, someone asked about the teaching perspectives inventory. If you Google teaching perspectives inventory, you'll get to the website. There's a really good book that came out that goes long. It's 5 perspectives on teaching adults. There is a second edition. I will disclose I have a chapter in that book. Dan Pratt was not my supervisor in grad school, but I tortured the poor man when he taught me. And the way he punished me, he said, great, you need to write a chapter for the revisers of this book. Okay. And I wrote, they're different. The TPI comes up with 5 different archetypes of a teacher. And one of them is the social reformer, the person who thinks the purpose of teaching is to transform society. And I am your archetypal social reform academic, and not many people would put that in writing. So he said, could you write that chapter for me? Yeah, I'll put that in the draft. I'm not in trouble. But the answers it gives you, it is a psychometric, and it is calibrated, and it is validated. I think something like 70,000 people have completed it. It's used in a lot of teacher development programs around the world. It's available in multiple languages, but it actually, the scores are the scores, but what they do is it's an entree into a reflection about who I am as a teacher, which is why I use it. It's a really good tool for that. The important thing with the TPI, though, is always think about one course you teach when you answer it. Because if you're like me and you teach multiple things, the answer to every question is, it depends. Sometimes, maybe. Everything's a middle of the road, where if you say, when I'm teaching my online course in advanced clinical e-learning, what do I do and why do I do it? The answers are more precise. You can do it for different things if you want and see if the scores are different, and they will be, and it'll be interesting, but doing it for all of your teaching in one thing ends up with it's like ending up with a mashed potato with no gravy and no butter. Yes?
University have teaching policies, and if you do, does this sort of underpin the peer review process?
So the question was, does our university have teaching quality standards, and does this underview the peer review process? We have academic standards related to promotion, but they are qualitative in nature. They're not quantitative in nature. And peer esteem is one thing that can be considered, but the student evaluations are still key. Having said that, in this faculty, if you have not had your teaching peer reviewed, you will not get promoted. It simply will not happen, because we just think it's too important to process. And because a lot of our teaching is about challenging, like Reese said this morning, challenging students' worldviews, you know, a lot of times the Reese Jones in the world get slaughtered by the students because they've made them think about racism, right? Or worse, maybe New Zealand isn't wonderful, right? So they go, oh, I'm very uncomfortable with what I learned, so I'm going to give this guy all 1s, right? I mean, I like him, I believe him, nice man, he assessed me fairly, but I'm uncomfortable. So I'll give him a 2, right? So we are very mindful of the fact that a lot of our teaching that has a transformative element to it, those colleagues in particular are the ones who are put in jeopardy because of student evaluations. So. Hi. So the question was, I slagged off when we had to go remote. Are there any things that came good out of going remote? The big thing that came out of going remote was that people realized there were options besides standing in front of the room and nattering. And the other good thing was people realized in a much broader sense that by doing some stuff online and possibly asynchronously, the students that we have that are who have challenging access to university, and I don't mean just getting into university, I mean actually literally getting here and having something to eat if they need to be here for 8 hours and study and go to the library. For them, the flexibility that blended or online offers them actually makes university more accessible because they can manage it with this. Having said that, the other thing we managed quite a lot of in 2020 in this university is the surprising number of students that either had broadband that was tied to a mobile plan and we're living in a household with 12 or 15 other people who are all sharing the same data and didn't have devices that could allow them to do everything they needed to do online. So we had a lot of devices that went out on loan that never came back, and we kind of knew that was going to happen, but they stayed enrolled with us, so that's okay. We didn't buy them new high-spec laptops. We took ones we had that were gathering dust and sent them out. We even, for some students, bought them 4G data dongles, but even then, it was like, because a lot of them culturally couldn't say to their family, you can't use it too. You know, they'd be doing their work and, you know, grandpa's watching Netflix, all of a sudden the data's gone. So so the possibility, I would say the big plus of it was it introduced the notion of possibility, right? It opened people's minds to things. And for those of us that are already working in that space, I should also say our faculty was offering something like 85% of the online courses in the entire university prior to that. Because of health professionals, you know, if you make all of your postgraduate health professional training opportunities face-to-face and you need people to come to a campus once a week, unless you're based in Wellington, Auckland, or Dunedin, or Hamilton, or one of the cities that has a university, you simply cannot engage with things. So we've been using online for quite some time. The one area we're trying to use it for more is we consider our position in the Pacific as something that we should be doing more leadership in, and trying to create some programs that students who are offshore can actually do largely or entirely online. The barrier we run into with that is actually funding. People do not want to fund international students to study online at the University of Auckland. They want them fund them to come to New Zealand for a while and study. And if you're a nurse practitioner on an island and you come here for 9 months, you're quite possibly not going to be replaced for those 9 months. And that person has to say, what are the benefits to my community for going here versus leaving? And so that's a space that we need to do it more. But we really have had a lot of crappy ideas of what they thought online learning was from 2020 and 2021 that we really had to kind of knock on people's doors sometimes and say, you just shouldn't be doing this. It's not facilitating learning, and that's what we should be doing. Gloria.
I feel I don't teach online, but I design for online. I used to be a full-time teacher for more now I design at home. And one thing I noticed after COVID is that I would say the appetite for seeing more online opportunities, synchronous or asynchronous. But what I am noticing, the students that I follow through the designs I have done, is that they also, some of them now, because of the generation of social media and video, they want that their online experience mimics a little bit what they have in their personal life. And of course, I think the work of distance education and teaching for online and business is still lagging a little bit of that. I mean, we are now headed in the right direction, but I am seeing that the students are added for things that are better designed, more structured, they are more interesting. So educators and designers of design for online, we have a lot of work to do. What do you think about that?
So the very hyper summary of what Gloria said was, A lot of young people's lived experience, including things like social media, they come to an expectation of that's what online learning experience should be like, and to some extent. And what do I think about that? I have mixed feelings about it, actually. We have we had a thing that's been at the university now for 4 years called Auckland Online, which is a separate standalone service unit that's designing new online credentials. And their standard is signing up for their program enrolling in their program should be like signing up for Netflix. In other words, much easier than it is currently to enroll as a university student. I actually endorse that principle if it should be easier, but I don't know if it should be that easy, right? And what they're finding is a lot of the students are enrolling for some of the specific courses in those credentials, but not actually enrolling in the credential because they still have to go through all those processes anyway. So it's kind of a smoke and mirrors thing. I kind of look at this way, the same thing as when people talk about badging and gamification. Like, I guess in some context that makes a lot of sense, but our health students aren't interested in badges. They're not interested in games. They are hyper focused on being able to manage content, content acquisition, but then really want to talk to someone about how do they use it meaningfully and what are the things they should understand that aren't really covered in the content that we're asking them to learn. And that's what they want. That's what they want an experience for. And what we are doing certainly in this faculty of more is we're trying to move more and more towards program level assessment because of a lot of our programs have competency frameworks. And the obvious and clear platform for doing that is an e-portfolio. But because it's a new space for much of us in the university and the faculty, getting the decision makers to understand the value of those platforms has been challenging. It is changing, though. It's changing in this faculty. And one of the things that we're using as kind of a lost leader is one of the platforms allows you to have clinical assessors who do not have paid accounts. That got my decision makers' ears pricked up. Wait, all those people who do clinical assessments, we can get them to do them and we don't have to pay for their accounts? That might be worth buying some student licenses. But it's the pedagogy that should be driving it, really. So the course that Ashwini and I teach, we're trying to do it by stealth. We require the students, almost all of whom teach for us here at the faculty, we require them to do an e-portfolio so they have the experience of doing it. And they all say at the end, I'd like to use this in my teaching. So, but yeah, user interfaces, the online experience, I'm kind of a heretic. I actually think that we need to use less multimedia and we need to use more text because students are very good at integrating text knowledge. And we should give them the curational skills to seek out other resources that they can use for their purposes, rather than just doing what we hand them, taking what we hand to them, just trying to get them understand what we chose and why, and then give them some parameters on how they can go out and get more. Because we want them all to be self-regulated learners by the time they leave here. I'd even like some of them to be self-determined learners in their professional development, oitagogues, to use the word. But that's a big shift in the cultures of our various disciplines. And we are over time. So thanks, everybody. Lunch is upstairs, just outside this room, and enjoy the rest of the conference.